Well, welcome everybody. This is Transitioning into Practice, our webinar series for residents and fellows, our trainees of the School of Medicine. Thank you for logging on this evening. I hope this series will provide you with some information and resources that will be useful to you. Our presenter this evening is Kelly McBeain. She is legal counsel for the University of Utah. In advance of Kelly's presentation, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping notes. Our original welcome person, Jenny, unfortunately is delayed, so I am going to stand in. My name's Jackie Voland. I'm the Associate Director of the School of Medicine Alumni Association, and we'd be happy to provide you with resources and connections following this seminar if you have anything that we can help you with. There are 4 more in the series, and hopefully you're receiving the reminders about the other elements. On housekeeping notes, we'll have you on mute unless we see some questions coming up on the chat that we think are bubbling up, and then we'll pause and ask Kelly to clarify her question or her statement if there's something you're concerned about. But otherwise, the presenter will run through the slides, and then we will follow up with a Q&A following the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to present Kelly McBeain, JD, Associate General Counsel for University of Utah, who will be talking on contracts.
Thank you, Jackie.
To share your screens.
All right. Thank you all for joining me tonight to talk about this very exciting topic of contract negotiation. So I'm going to sort of just first start out with a general overview of some basic concepts about contracts and the negotiation process. And then I will talk about some basic contract provisions that you're likely to see, the things to watch out for, and then I'll briefly talk about hospital guarantees. So let's kind of start from the beginning. Typically, the way the employment process will work for you is that you'll identify groups you're interested in joining, you'll have an interview, then after the interview, they'll present you with an offer letter or a contract. So during this process, I think it's really important that the first question you ask yourself is whether the employer and you are a good fit. If you're a good fit, you can probably sign the contract, put it in a drawer, and not have to worry about it ever again because things are likely to work themselves out. On the other hand, if you don't have a good fit, even the most artfully drafted contract is not going to make things right. So you should always ask yourself whether it's a group that you trust and whether they're people you want to spend a lot of time with. Another question to ask yourself when you get that contract is, do you need a lawyer to review it? So this depends a lot on your risk tolerance. You should always go ahead and read the contract yourself first. And if you've read it and you understand it and it seems reasonable, maybe you don't need a lawyer to review it. On the other hand, if there are things that you don't understand that seem unreasonable, or if you're just nervous about contracts generally, getting a lawyer's input may just give you that peace of mind that you need to feel better about it. Now, if you're dealing with a recruiter, some recruiters will say to you, don't worry, this is just a standard contract. But I can tell you that there's no such thing as a standard contract. It might be the standard form contract for that particular employer, but really no 2 contracts are the same. And it's also important to note that some employers are more willing than others to negotiate changes to their contracts. So for example, somebody like Intermountain Healthcare will typically only make very minor revisions to their form contract. But typically in those situations, when it's such a big organization, not very many revisions are needed. But smaller groups, on the other hand, are much more willing to negotiate changes to their contracts, in my experience. So once you've received a contract from a potential employer, I'd encourage you to read it carefully and identify any areas of concern that you have. If you decide that you do want input from an attorney, this would be the time now to do it. Have them review it and give you their input. If you don't have a lawyer review it, then I would suggest that if there are changes that you want made to the contract, that you write those changes out specifically rather than giving feedback that's pretty general, because you're not likely to get the changes that you're looking for if you do that. So then you would send your comments back to the employer, whether they're your comments or the attorney's comments that you engage. They review them and let you know what changes they're willing to make or not make. So let's talk about kind of what the basic contract provisions that you're likely to see in the contracts that you're receiving. So pretty much every contract, you should see a description of your job responsibilities. If you're less than full-time, it should specifically state what your FTE commitment is. Some agreements will specify the call coverage requirements. Others will simply say that you'll share call with the other physicians in the group. And it's also very common for the contract to say that you'll devote your full professional effort to the group. So this means that unless you get permission from the group, you shouldn't be doing any moonlighting or side jobs in your spare time. And then finally, if you're joining a group that has multiple practice locations, I would recommend that your contract specify what location it is that you are going to be working at. Because if there's multiple locations and you think that you're going to be working at one, and all of a sudden they change that, you don't obviously want to think that you're going to go work at LDS Hospital and buy a house in the Avenues and then find out you need to go, work down in the southern part of the county. So that's something to look out for as well. Now, another basic provision that you should see is with respect to the term or duration of the contract. And this can really vary. So some contracts are only for a year with the expectation that they'll renew from year to year, while others may be for as long as 5 years. But sort of the most important issue with respect to the term or duration of the contract is whether you can terminate. So that's the most common question that we receive. Can I terminate my contract? So I encourage you to always be thinking about what your exit strategy is. Most contracts that we see can be terminated with 60 to 90 days notice without cause. And you want that notice period to be long enough that if they're terminating you, you are able to go find other employment, but not long enough that if you're the one terminating, that you have to stay on for a much longer period of time. So you'll just need to think about kind of the consequences of early termination, but we'll talk about some of those things a little bit later. So another basic provision, probably I'm sure to most of you, the most important part of the contract, the compensation and benefits. As I'm sure you all know, compensation can really vary depending on your type of practice, but the typical model that we see for the first year or two is to have a fixed or guaranteed salary, and then you'd move to a productivity model. But some specialties may be fixed for your whole career. Then with respect to insurance, which is a benefit that you should receive, the employer should always provide malpractice insurance coverage. And that should specifically be spelled out in your contract. Then other benefits like vacation, health insurance, retirement, they might be specifically spelled out in your contract, but a lot of times what we see is that you'll just receive what other members of the group receive through your employment policies. Employers just typically want to have flexibility to make changes to those policies. And so if it's, specific to each physician's contract, then it gives them less flexibility to make those changes. And And if they aren't specifically spelled out, I would recommend that if you're working with a recruiter, you ask that recruiter what the benefits are, or you ask the employer directly. And then it's also pretty common for employers to offer other incentives like student loan repayment, signing bonuses, covering moving expenses. And honestly, if it's not in the contract, it doesn't hurt to ask. We've had many contracts where physicians have gone back and asked for some of these things or a greater signing bonus. And it's pretty surprising what employers are willing to agree to. So I also suggest that you include language in the contract that the employer will pay for board prep materials, exam costs, and travel related to that, as well as expenses related to your ongoing continuing education. So now let's talk about kind of the more problematic areas and things to watch out for in the contracts that you receive. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the most common questions we get is, how do I get out of my contract, and what are the implications of terminating? So as I said before, it's important that you can terminate the contract without cause on 60 to 90 days notice. You also need to understand, though, what the penalties are of terminating your contract. So in some contracts that we've seen, there will be a liquidated damages provision, which essentially means that you need to pay a monetary penalty in order to terminate the contract if you terminate early. It's also pretty common to see that if you leave before the end of, say, the first or second year, you'll need to repay all or some portion of any sort of, signing bonus, loan guarantee, or other types of incentives like those. The other big area of concern is tail coverage. So for those of you who may not be familiar with tail coverage, it's basically an insurance concept that says that your insurance only applies while you're employed with that particular employer. So once you quit, that insurance doesn't apply anymore. So even though you may have left your employment with, let's say, the University of Utah Hospital, the next day you could get sued for work that you did while you were employed at the University of Utah. So to protect against this, you need to purchase tail coverage. And so in employment contracts, typically, the vast majority of them usually say that it will be your responsibility to pay for tail coverage when you leave your employment, regardless of whether you decide to leave or they terminate you. Whatever the reason might be, it would be your responsibility. I mean, sometimes you'll see that the employer will pay unless you're terminating early or you're terminated for cause. And I'd say in the minority of the cases, let's say 20%, employers will pay for tail coverage no matter what the reason is for termination and who terminates. And the cost of tail coverage can really vary based on the nature of your practice. So low risk specialties, say like pathology, might be around $15,000 to $20,000 for tail coverage, while more high risk specialties like OBGYN might be somewhere more in the range of $100,000. But in the event that you have a contract where the employer is not willing to pay for tail coverage, it's not the end of the world, because typically if you're joining a new group, you can negotiate with them to have them provide the tail coverage. So if you are leaving, it is important to think about that when negotiating with your new employer. Then another area of concern, sometimes we see language in employment contracts related to indemnification, where the employee is required to indemnify the group for any claims relating to your practice that are not covered by insurance. So this could be potentially very problematic because it could impose significant personal financial liability on you. So if you do see an indemnity provision in a contract that you receive, I would strongly encourage you to get outside advice to make sure that you understand the potential scope of your own personal liability. and what you're assuming in that under that contract. Then another issue that frequently comes up in almost every contract is a non-compete clause. So essentially, this is a requirement that says that when you leave your employment, you won't work in a competing practice within some geographic area from your old group. Typically, that geographic area is like a 10 to 20 mile radius around your previous group, which is also another reason that it's important to specifically identify what location you will be working at to limit the scope of that non-compete. So you just want to be sure that you fully understand the requirements of that non-compete, and that in the event that you terminate your employment, you're able to, go find other employment in a location you want to be. So the last thing, kind of the big issue that I'll touch upon, and it's become less common, although I have seen this recently. It's become less common because hospitals are increasingly employing physicians directly themselves rather than supporting separate independent groups. But it's a kind of complicated relationship that's worth touching on in case you do encounter this in a contract that you receive. So essentially, if you're part of an independent group, a hospital may be willing to pay some part of the startup costs of your practice and guarantee a portion of your salary. So in the event that the group's collections fall short of your guaranteed salary during the first year or two of your practice, then the hospital essentially makes up the difference. So it's treated like a loan. So if you stay in the hospital service area, for some period of time after when they've provided this support, so let's say 2 to 4 years about is kind of what we see, the hospital will essentially forgive the loan. But if you leave the service area before the end of the forgiveness period, you may need to repay some or all of the salary support from the hospital. So this can be a great deal, obviously, if you're intending to stay in that service area, because the hospital takes on, essentially all of the risk related to your new practice. But if you leave the area before the end of that forgiveness period, you could potentially be repaying a significant amount of money, depending on how large that loan was. So if you do have an offer with a hospital salary guarantee, I think, like indemnity language, this is, again, another one of the more complicated issues. And I would encourage you to get some advice from somebody who's experienced with these types of guarantees, because not only because that there can be serious penalties for termination, but even if you don't terminate early, as a result of the forgiveness of the loan, there are various tax implications because it's treated like income tax, or I'm sorry, it's treated like income. So you would likely have to pay income tax on that amount. So it can be kind of a tricky structure. So that kind of concludes the major issues and basic provisions that I am covering this evening. So I am happy to take any questions that people have.
Kelly, we have a question in the chat box. It says, I knew a trainee who had their job offer pulled when they tried to negotiate the terms of their contract. Should that be a red flag if we encounter that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that if they expect you to just accept the agreement as is, that's probably not a place that you want to be employed. I think that's pretty indicative of, things to come.
If anybody would like to directly ask a question, please do so. We'll go ahead and unmute your mics for you. So please just either raise your hand or just open up.
Hi, I had put this in the chat box, but how do you feel, what's the best way to go about hiring counsel to review contracts? You may have mentioned this in the beginning, but I may have missed it. And also in the context of that, just a global idea about how much usually people pay to have someone review their contracts?
Yeah, so this can be kind of tricky because not a lot of people have experience in this area. And so sometimes I know people run into the problem of hiring somebody who really doesn't understand the structure of these types of agreements, and people end up paying a bunch of money for not great legal advice. So I would say, well, I will say I do offer that service. We have done that historically for residents at a pretty reduced price. But otherwise, if you're seeking somebody outside of the university, I would just make sure that they have, some sort of experience in the healthcare world, because they don't, I think they're going to miss some of these bigger issues that are unique to physician contracts. In terms of what you would pay to have it done, honestly, it could vary all over the place. I mean, you could be paying probably anywhere from $350 to, I don't know, $700 an hour for somebody's time.
We have any other questions? Is everybody able to unmute themselves? Well, Kelly, it sounds like you're off the hook. You were so succinct. Everybody's got clarity. Let me stop sharing here and then put up, let's see, put your slide back up here. So this is Kelly's email if you would like to reach out to her, and one of our team will also put it in the chat box. So if you have any follow-up questions, or something burning pops into your brain later on this evening, Kelly has generously offered to answer some questions for you in follow-up to this. Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, I'd like to say thank you very much to you, Kelly, for spending some time with us and our group of participants. We will have another webinar next Thursday, so please stay tuned for those. I believe our next one is on financial planning, and there will be an invitation. This recording will be shared to those who have registered, following us editing it and making sure that it's everything it's nice and clean documents. So with that, if we have no other questions, thank you very much for joining us, and have a good evening.